Well, welcome to our next session in track 4. I'm Kinga Petrova, a learning consultant, and I will introduce the next talk, which is about models and methods of online team teaching, which will be modeled during this session, how online team teaching works, which I'm really looking forward to. And our speakers are Professor Gary Natriello, who's professor of sociology and education here at Teachers College at Columbia University. He teaches graduate courses in network learning, data ethics, assessment processes, and research methods. And he is co-presenting with Professor Hui Shu Che, who is the executive director of the Center of Academic Excellence and Support at the School of Professional Studies at New York University. And he is also the adjunct assistant professor in the programs of learning analytics, cognitive science at Teachers College here in Columbia. So thank you very much for doing this presentation, and I'll pass it on to you.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction. We're going to get started, and as Kinga said, we're going to try as best we can to model a little bit of how we have actually team taught, which means we're going to be throwing this back and forth to each other as we go through the session, in the hopes that it'll be engaging. But of course, we hope that every week with our class too. And what we thought we would do is we thought that for the chat, if you have comments that you want us to address in the middle of the presentation, if you put those in the chat, Hisu's going to keep an eye on that. And then if you have comments for the end of the presentation, if you put those in the Q&A, I think Kinga can put those together for the end if there's time, and then we can address those as well. So we'll get started, and our agenda is really to, in addition to welcoming you to the session and explaining a little bit, we'll give you a little bit of background and context of how we came to start thinking about team teaching, mostly because we were doing it, where we found sources of models for thinking about team teaching, what in our situation it amounted to when we actually started practicing it. And then we'll conclude by actually all the stuff we're thinking about for the fall semester, which is how do we evolve this set of techniques and practices. So for the welcome and session plan, we're going to review pretty much what we've covered in the paper. So if you want more detail, you can grab the paper, which should be available. And then we're going to try to, as I said, try to model the practice, and then end up with comments and questions. So to give a little background on our situation, and I should note, Hisu is going to jump in and elaborate and add to all the things that I'm saying, and add all the corrections, just like he does when we teach every week.
It's a valuable service that I had to add every class session.
It really, this is like staff development for me. So if people are in need of staff development, you call Hisu, he'll help you out. So for a little bit of background, so we have been teaching a set of online graduate courses over the last, I guess, 3 years. We first started teaching online. Well, we taught online years ago, probably 15 years ago. And then we drifted away from teaching online. And then more recently with the pandemic, we picked up teaching online again. And we've taught a series of courses over the last 3 years. And we're interested enough in the techniques and the opportunities to think we're going to at least do it for a while longer. These classes these are typically master's classes. So if you're familiar with Teachers College, they're master's classes at Teachers College in the Department of Human Development. And the enrollment runs 20 to 25, so a nice size class. And our goal for these classes, which is, at least from our perspective, what makes them challenging, is to lead our group of students to become self-directed learners. And we'll talk as we get into it a little bit about the ways in which we've tried to do that, where we think we've been somewhat successful and where we think we still have a ways to go. And our approach has been project-based. So each class is organized around 4 to 5 projects over the course of the semester. Each of the projects lasts about 4 weeks or so. And in order to do these projects, students are organized into small teams. And ideally, the teams are 3 or 4 people. Sometimes they get as high as 5 people, but relatively small teams. And in terms of additional arrangements, things that we've kind of evolved on our own over this period of time, we've got them on a course platform that's built on a WordPress foundation, so a WordPress structure with the LearnDash learning management system, which some of you may be familiar with. It's pretty lightweight addition to WordPress, not overly built or overly developed, but lots of capacity, or at least plenty of capacity. And in our situation, most of what we want is flexibility, and so it's given us that. And then most recently, we've added the BuddyPress plugin to that, which allows students to do collaborative work and have collaborative groups. So that's kind of the platform. The focus, as we mentioned, and I'm going to say a little bit about each of these in more detail, right? So the focus is on small learning teams. Most of the class, or much of the class, is asynchronous discussion, but there's a weekly synchronous class. And the goal is to support the teams with support and individual check-in. So that's
Jerry,
kind of
we got a question from Maddie.
Okay.
About whether the teams change throughout the semester. I put into the chat that the teams actually, once we formed them at the start of the semester, they stayed together for the entire semester. Can you say a little bit about why we made that design choice and some of the pros and cons of that decision, you think, and what you think we might do in the future?
Yeah, so that's so you've hit a really good question, and it's a question that Hisu and I have argued about kind of repeatedly. And at one point we did change once during the semester, and we decided not to do that. And the idea was to sort of form a team that would stay together through the semester so that we could make the projects a bit more cumulative. So you start on project 1, you build a foundation, you use some of the things from project 1 to do project 2, and so forth up to the final project. And I have to say that that's been a point of contention both between myself and Hisu in terms of the pros and cons, but also among the students. So we just looked at the last set of student course evaluations, and one of the complaints, so basically get kind of two kinds of evaluations. One set of students say, oh, this team is the best experience I've ever had, and I've made a bunch of lifelong friends. And then you have another group of students who say, I'm trapped with these losers on my team. Please, professor, in the future, please change teams. And I think he said that's kind of the big issue, right? How well the teams work together.
Yeah, I think, one of the other reasons we made that choice is we were trying to borrow from agile work practices. And so we thought, in order for people to learn how to collaborate with one another, there would be some benefit to keeping folks together. I think in the future, one of the things we might do is switch up groups, but not for every phase of the project, but maybe halfway in the semester. So I think it's an area we still want to experiment with. But thank you, Maddie, for that question.
It's a good question. So let's move on, Hisu, and just sort of show them the course platform quickly. So we didn't bring the platform, but we've got a slide that shows the entryway to the course. And that's just kind of the course overview. Again, it's a pretty simple platform that just tees up all of the resources and the projects. And then along the side there, you see those are the student groups. And we've taken to this practice of always developing student groups and student group names that are related to the content of the course. So this particular course that we're showing here is our Technology and Human Development course. And the student teams were all had names related to major technologies that we were looking at in the course. We also, yes, Jesus says yes. We also let students come up with better names for better names and better images for the courses if they want to. And sometimes they want to, and sometimes they don't. But the idea is to have one platform where all the readings and resources are there, where the students can have discussion. We haven't quite gotten all the tools that we might like to have connected to the platform, but that's something we'll talk about at the end that we're sort of working on. So as I mentioned, there is asynchronous discussion, as you see on the next slide. And I should say that, you know, what we've done for the slides, it's up. That's falling. You're right. We're a slide behind. What we've done for anything involving students is kind of giving you a fuzzy image of it so that we're protecting student identities. But there was an asynchronous discussion available for students that was both a class level discussion board and then a team level discussion board. And Heesu, you want to say a little bit about how that distinction worked?
Yeah, I think, you know, we use the whole class discussion as a way for, you know, as a way to engage everyone in the topics for a particular week. And so, you know, the whole class discussion is where students pose questions about readings or another piece or another resource that was central to a project. And so, you know, that happened asynchronously. And oftentimes students would post reflections, pose questions to one another, respond to one another. We purposely built that strategy into the whole class discussion. The team discussion, you know, the only people who had access to the team discussion threads were obviously the team members and Gary and myself. And we use that as a way to support teams on their specific projects every week, because individual project check-ins were so important. You know, we really, you know, encourage strongly students to use that team discussion as a way to get help on their projects, get feedback through that mechanism. And, you know, we were really pleasantly surprised. I mean, we're used to students using WeChat or WhatsApp. And, you know, I think there was still a certain level of that was going on. But what we said to students was, hey, you know, we're really here to support you and your learning. And so, you know, make what's going on in your teams transparent. You know, make that really explicit and share it with us. And so we were really pleasantly surprised by how much students were using the team discussion as a way to communicate with us and communicate with each other.
And you know, I should add to that we avoided asynchronous discussion in our classes for quite a while. And the reason is about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, whatever it was, when we were using both Blackboard and Moodle, and we had sort of the typical discussion boards, what we found is students were using discussions as things to just check off. That is, I'm going to make a comment. It's not going to be particularly reflective or thoughtful, but the professor is going to look to see how many comments I make. And so when we set up this discussion board, and we really just added it this last year, we were very deliberate along the lines that Heesu suggested, so that each board had a particular purpose. And you'll even see as we get a little bit further along that in the team roles, certain members of the team had certain things they were going to do on the discussion board. So it wasn't a typical open-ended kind of discussion board that, at least for us, hadn't worked really well in the past. So in addition to this, the discussion, and again, the idea was, you know, in an ideal world, we would have students running in their small teams doing the kind of learning where they were directing the learning in a very substantial way. And particularly as we got to the end of the course, they were more in charge of their own learning rather than dependent upon the instructors. But what we learned in trying to do that in some earlier iterations is it was really helpful for us to have a weekly whole class meeting. So on the next slide, you see just a representation of what we typically found on a weekly basis, which was our Zoom group. And we did a weekly Zoom session for the class. And the whole purpose of that was for everyone to sort of regroup, remind everyone the class is still going on, check in on how the teams were doing, and then get them hopefully revved up for what their teams needed to be doing in the coming week. But that was where Heesoo and I often got into, I don't want to say disputes, but where Heesoo was the clock watcher. And you want to tell them about the clock watching activity, Heesoo?
Well, I was just about to tell you, you're getting ahead of yourself, Gary. So we're going to talk in a minute about how we set up each project. But in terms of clock watching, we set up pretty elaborate scripts for the class, and we because the courses were so structured, and we wanted to give groups enough time to work with one another on these projects. One of my key roles was making sure we were aware of how our time was being spent together. Because the time when we got together weekly, there was a bit of recitation, a bit of discussion, but we really did want to leverage that time to do really, really valuable active learning with students.
Right. And that's kind of reflected on the next slide, which is, and this is now something that everyone talks about, right? Moving from center stage where the instructors are in the middle to really on the side where the instructors are supporting student learning. And, we've been practicing that in one way or another for quite a while. And at least our own experience, I don't know other people's experience, our own experience is that it's really easy to lapse back into an instructor dominated environment. And so, one of the things, and you'll see as we talk a little bit later, one of the things that the team teaching approach did for us is with both of us in the session, you would think that would be, too much instructor presence. But I think we were able to figure out a way to actually make it less than what we would have had if we just had one of us, and to make the part that we engaged in a little more conversational, a little bit more efficient and faster, and then bringing the students into the process more quickly than we otherwise might have been. So the whole notion was, we're going to be a little more conversational, a little less presentational, and we're going to invite the students into the conversation. We'll talk about toward the end where, what some of the techniques of doing that were. So I did mention that the teams were somewhat structured, and on the next slide you see a set of roles that we assign to the teams. So we've been working with small learning teams through all of these classes, and even before we were teaching online. And those of you who know all the literature on small teams know that there are lots of different ways to organize them, that some of them seem to work better under certain circumstances than other strategies, that no one has, the final answer to that. And we've been experimenting with the teams. And one of the things we've been doing is trying out different sets of roles, so that for every project, each member of the team has a role. So here you see, we've got a facilitator role, a recorder role, a spokesperson role, and a delivery agent role. And we've got responsibilities assigned to each of them. And then for each project, the roles rotate. So that if there are 4 people in the team and there are 4 projects in the semester, each member of the team gets to play each of the roles at least once, and have the products that are associated with that. Again, we've kind of gone back and forth on this, and Heesoo, I think you've been somewhat less pleased with how the roles have worked than I have been. So you keep suggesting new ways of tweaking them. You want to say a little more about that, and particularly around the agile process?
Well, I think the last time we taught together, the technology and human development course, I think the roles actually worked out pretty well. I was pleasantly surprised, but I think the key was making it really, really clear to students what each person was responsible for. I think we just wanted to make sure every role in the group was substantive. So, we didn't want to have a role where students almost got to check out on a project. And so I think the key thing that we did was, we made sure for every role there was an activity that was substantive enough for everyone. So, for example, we would say to the deliverable agent, because this was the person that was in charge of finally organizing all the materials, the weekly things that were supposed to be delivered. We also asked that person to identify resources outside of the required course readings, to augment each project. And so I think, the big learning from the last time we taught this was, make each role substantive and make sure students understand the responsibilities of each role. The other major innovation, Gary, I think would be useful for you to talk about is the weekly report that you had teams do. Why don't you say a little bit about that? Because I think that was a really, really important accountability measure.
Yeah, so this is something that we added, I think the last time that we taught the course, and over the last couple of years we've changed the kind of level of assignments and the frequency of assignments and things of that sort. And so this time around, and earlier on, we had used a much more formal Scrum process, in which students were trying to learn the Scrum roles and rituals and apply them. And one of the things we discovered, even with both of us working on it, and both of us having been through Scrum training, not Scrum certified, but at least through Scrum training, it was just an awful lot for students to kind of get their minds around while they were trying to understand Scrum and Agile, and then simultaneously trying to master the course material. So we backed off a little bit from that, and we created a more simplified version. And one of the simple pieces that we created was this kind of weekly report on activities. And we asked them to submit once a week. What does your team do? It wasn't as detailed as might be done in the Scrum system. And of course, we didn't have things like the daily stand-up and things of that sort. But it gave them a level of engagement and accountability that I think had been missing from the earlier courses. Oddly enough, it seemed to work to make the projects better. The reports themselves, I would say the quality of them varied a lot, depending upon, where the team was and who the reporter was. But even though the quality of the reports varied, the fact that they had to do the reports, I think, ended up giving us projects that were really much more successful than before we did that. So
the other strategy that I do is I advance slides to kind of give Gary the hint. It's time to move on. So that's what I've just done.
Right. So so we're moving on to this, to the project structure, just to give people a little better understanding of that. And like we said, each project was about 4 weeks. First week was kind of introducing and clarifying the project. And surprisingly, it requires a lot of clarification. Or a lot more clarification than I might imagine. And I think, Hisu, you and I are very different in this regard. I think I always assume everyone's going to get it right away, and you always assume they're not going to get it unless we do a lot more work, right? I mean, to help them get it. That's accurate, right?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean,
That's what,
it's very interesting. Gary and I have taught together for a long time, and we've known each other for over 20 years. And so we have a sense of what we're both like as educators. And I'm probably a little bit more directive, and Gary's probably a little bit more open. And so it's interesting when we work together on courses. And we'll talk a little bit about how that played out during our team approach.
so to pick up on that, so we had the clarification week, then we had the week where they were gathering additional resources and reviewing resources, and in that week we would be back and forth in conversation with them, either through text or at the synchronous meeting. Hisu was often in the discussion boards, and I was more likely to be meeting with them on a separate team Zoom. So we did a little bit of both of those things. So it's one of the reasons why we're interested in what Laura has to say about instructor presence, because we feel we did a lot for instructor presence, but we felt it was incredibly time consuming, even with two of us working on the course. So we're looking for how to keep instructor presence strong as a facilitator of independent learning, while also making it sustainable for the instructor. Then in the third week, we typically had a kind of sharing of a prototype or an initial draft of a product that was coming, that the project deliverable was going to be. And oftentimes that was either sharing with the whole class, sharing with one of the instructors, where we sometimes did breakouts, or it was just pairing up with another team and sharing with that team. And then finally in week 4, it was kind of, submitting the final deliverables. If they had changed in a substantial way, kind of sharing that, and then getting them ready for the next project. So that's kind of all background as to how the course kind of functioned and operated. But I think, to be honest, I think, as Hisu said, we've worked together for a long time. So I think we kind of drifted into team teaching, and stumbled a little bit into team teaching. And so this paper was really an occasion for us to start thinking about, okay, what are some of the models that are out there, and which are the ones that we think we might have, at least intuitively, if not deliberately, developed and incorporated into our own practice. So when we thought about it, it came down to there being kind of 3 sources of these models. And I'm going to just step a little bit through each one of them to sort of get a sense of what we think we've kind of borrowed from each of them. They're face-to-face models. There are models from broadcast media, and then there are production team models. And we have, just from other work that we've done, a little bit of experience with each of those. Obviously, we've taught face-to-face before we taught online. We have engaged in at least online broadcasting from time to time. And we've also operated production teams. And Hisu's currently still operating a production team of sorts. So we've got a little bit of experience. So what do we sort of see as kind of the takeaways from those models? So for the face-to-face models, and this is just a standard, this is the kind of thing, if you go to the literature, you find that, these 6 different models of face-to-face teaching, and different configurations. And interestingly enough, they're all configured around classroom layout, which is kind of interesting, right? So you've got a teacher in the front and the back, a teacher in the front and the side, 2 teachers in the front. You've got the classroom split. You've got groups and stations and things like that. And to some extent, it's all ways of dividing up labor. And we've probably done a little bit of each of those. So in the synchronous session, we're pretty much what they call teaming model 5. We're both kind of in the session teaming. But we've also done kind of the small groups where we break up into groups. So some weeks we've broken the end of the class, we've broken them into groups, and Hisu and I would rotate in and among the groups, or we'd stay in kind of the main digital space, and then student groups would call on us when they needed help. And so we've trying to taken advantage of those. But we've also learned a little bit from just growing up with broadcast media, both as audience members and as aspiring production people in broadcast media. So there's the model of the co-hosts. There's there's the model of the host and the guest. We've done that. So I should say we've done teaming, but we've also done two other things, right? So we've done guests, and we've also done all of this with a TA. You want to say a little bit about those two experiences?
Yeah, I mean, in the program that we teach in, having students engage in real world projects is really, really important. And so we didn't do it often, but we would invite people that we knew from industry and companies and organizations that students might find themselves doing work in. We would invite them to class. And the way we'd structure it is, we'd have the guest, she, he, they would maybe do like a 15-20 minute talk. Then we divide the students into random groups and ask them to come up with a set of questions for the guest. And then when we'd all get back together, we'd call on each small group to pose one of the questions that they had for our guest. So that was like a really important practice, and students loved it. I mean, maybe it was because we were inviting people from places like Meta, where they were eager to work themselves, but students really appreciated meeting folks who were out in the field, alum of the college. It just made for a different kind of class experience for those specific sessions.
So those were I think that part of it is also varying things a little bit throughout the semester, so that each week when students came, there were certain things that were very familiar, but then there was always something that was different that we were trying. And sometimes we were trying it for the first time, which also made them interested in it because they knew we were experimenting a little bit. So there's also the sidekick model. And that's kind of an interesting model because it presumes that the two people know each other really well, and there's a whole set of understandings. And Hisu and I have both played the sidekick. So and we'll talk about this when we get to the discussion of roles a little bit, but in some classes I've been kind of the lead, but in other classes he played the lead and I played the sidekick. The interesting thing about the sidekick model is because it's presumed to be someone who's a really close associate of the other person, there's a lot of informal back and forth interaction that you might not see. Certainly the kind of thing I did not see when I was part of a teaching team as a graduate student with my senior professors. This was much more of a friendly interaction. And part of what we were trying to do is to sort of model for students that kind of interaction is also fine for them to engage in. And they should interact with us in the same kind of way as someone that they shouldn't be afraid to ask questions and to admit failure and to share things that they needed to understand better. Then also on broadcast media, there's the remote model. And that's my favorite Huntley Brinkley picture from the 60s, where all of a sudden there was the ability to have one host in Europe and one host in North America. Hisu and I aren't quite that far apart, but we're never in the same room typically when we're teaching online. So we're at a distance, and we're also trying to negotiate the distance. And then there's the model with the band leader. Neither Hisu or I are running a band, but maybe that'll happen next semester. And so we've drawn on those models again to try to just change things up. And then the final set of models that we kind of look on is production teams. And those of you who've taught online know that there's a lot more, because we're dealing with so much technology, there's a lot more to manage than there is typically if you're in a classroom where everything is pretty apparent, although classrooms are getting to be technology production spaces too. So I wouldn't overstate that. But having the two of us has been really helpful to share some of that production capacity, capability. And even, kind of the simplest thing when we first started teaching, just being able to verify that each of us could be heard before the students got on. And then there are probably other things, Hisu, right, that you thought that you kept correcting me on that I wasn't getting quite right.
Well, I think, when you're team teaching, you can give each other feedback through private direct messages. And so, I think, being together like that, you're able to, give each other real-time feedback. Something's not working. I remember one time, Gary was having internet problems. And so I just took over. So, I think, that was another benefit. I just want to say a little bit about the current screen you're looking at. That screen on the right is actually Gary's desk. So that is what Gary actually uses in his teaching. Say just a little bit about this, Gary, because we're running long. So say just a little bit, and I want to contrast that with what I use.
Okay, so yeah, so I've been trying to get better at all of this, and I'm not as talented as Hisu, so I have to rely on a lot of tools. So the first thing I did was kind of separate audio from video, because everything I've read says audio is really important. So trying to figure out how to make your audio as good as you possibly can. So, on the desk there, you see, a Rodecaster, which just pulls together a lot of audio channels that can be combined and presumably sends them out in the right mix. But it's kind of a podcaster's tool. And we actually, reminds me of another model. We picked up a bunch of techniques from one of our students who was a podcaster, and shared with us early on information about mics and settings and all the things that we knew nothing about. So that was super helpful too. And just about in every class, we find some student who's got some expertise. So in the last class, we had a DJ. And so the DJ was always, I think, kind of commenting off to the side on my musical choices. So those are some of the sources of models. And now we should sort of go on and talk about, what are some of the challenges to actually doing this and sort of doing it on an ongoing basis, and how do you get to select these models, and if we start off with kind of the general constraints, and I do think the ball and chain image is the right one. So I don't know about most people, but most of us end up being in organizations where team teaching is not supported. And I think that's true of us as well. And I think, our situation has been that we try to support one another in our teaching. So the best example is the semester in which I was teaching and leading the course, and Hisu was nice enough to join me for the sessions, and he was teaching one later in the week, and I joined him for those sessions. And we kind of assisted each other, and so we had two team experiences rather than two solo experiences. I've never been able to get the dean or anyone else to support real team teaching, and now that I'm a department chair, I'm not allowed to support team teaching, even though I think it would make everyone's teaching better and more interesting and more exciting. So those, I think, are real constraints. And I think, the one way to try to work around them may be to rethink what teaching assistants are doing. And, one of my best team teaching experiences early in my career was as a TA in graduate school, where the professor built a team of TAs and let us basically share all the responsibilities with him in a way that most people will not do. So, I was a TA, I was a graduate TA, there was an undergraduate TA, and the professor, and we would rotate what we did. And it was really powerful learning, and I think a pretty interesting class. So I think reworking within some of those constraints, and I know those of us who are in New York with all kinds of regulations, sometimes TAs are not allowed to do any of those things. So we've got a whole environment, which is not very conducive. On the other hand, we also have some digital constraints. So it's Hisu and I originally started out team teaching in real physical space, and did that for many years. And that was, I think, although challenging, because you have to organize the space and support it and make it effective, also has limitations. And so some of the digital opportunities open up some things that you couldn't do elsewhere. And if nothing else, just the fact that you don't have to all be in the same place and time to do that. And then there's pedagogical issues, pedagogical constraints. One of the things that I think we experienced, and kind of early on, we're kind of surprised by it, is, and maybe we shouldn't have been, but team teaching online changes the whole visibility into the teaching practice that your students might have. Students can see you doing things in the online environment that you may be able to go to the back of the room and do in the physical environment, or at least do more quietly. And I think, what's happened in our case is all of that has become much more visible. And Hisu, maybe you want to say a little bit about that, because it's often your corrective comments of me that are highly visible that might not have been visible had we not been online.
Well, I think the other thing that, I of course love giving Gary a hard time, but the other
and the students love it even more, which is
the students love it even more. But I think the other real reason to do it was to model to students what a collegial, inclusive learning environment would look like. And so students were following our cues, so they knew it was acceptable. They knew it was encouraged to be like to pose questions to one another. We modeled how to interact with one another. We really used the chat. We really used a lot of the features that technology enabled, to create this active learning environment. And so, I think the other thing about team teaching, and I put this into the chat, you have to be really, really planned. You can't just wing it. I think, when Gary and I would teach in the physical classroom, we could show up and I think we could do a pretty decent job. But online, you have to know, hey, here's where we're going to make this transition. Here is where we need to play this video clip. Here is when we need to make random breakout rooms. Here is how we're going to call, the order that students are going to present in. It was a mini production. And so that's why those production models that we showed before were it really was a broadcast production for us.
Right. And I think the best evidence of that is, as soon as we finish with this conference presentation, which we will be finished this week, we're going to start prepping for our fall classes. And so, I think, I always prepared for classes, but I'm not sure I prepared as early and as collaboratively, sure not as collaboratively as we did for the online classes. So, I think that we want to shift now to a kind of concluding section, and we talk about, that's kind of the background and the models, and then just share a little bit more about what this was like in practice. And so again, our situation was we had a lot of experience working together, and we're pretty comfortable criticizing each other, praising each other, telling one another to throw out that plan and start all over, even though it was going to take the weekend to kind of redo it. And all of those kinds of stresses from collaboration. I think we had a benefit from having worked together for a long time. And I had the benefit because of working with Hisu, because I've said to Hisu years ago, working with him always was like working with my dad. And working with my dad was always challenging because he always wanted me to work harder. And so I'm able to take it from Hisu because he reminds me of my father, and I was pretty obedient. And still am. The challenge was, how do we can do this practice that we wanted to engage in? How do we do the kind of work we wanted to do with these small teams, and how do we make them self-directed learners in the end? Because that was kind of our goal. And in practice, that amounted to us taking on a set of roles ourselves. So we talked about the roles of the team, of the small groups, but in the following slide, we've actually got a list of roles that we played. And as I mentioned, this shows one configuration where I'm on the left and Hisu is on the right, but we've also flipped it where he's doing the things on the left and I'm doing the things on the right. And so in this particular configuration, there was a lot that I did on course design and content, teeing up the content and curating it, sort of outlining the sessions, and then kind of driving the sessions. And that was one of the things we kind of, I think, fell into, that it makes sense for the session to be coherent for one of us to decide to be the driver of that session and the other one to be supporting that driver. For us, at least, it was just too difficult to share equally within a session, because the coordination, particularly at a distance, is just really challenging. And then, reflecting on, responding to some of the reflections, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then giving feedback on the projects. And then, of course, Hisu would allow me to be the session DJ. So I got to select the music for the classes. And we used a lot of bumper music to introduce things, to get things going, to do transitions when students were coming back from breakouts and things like that. And students seemed to really appreciate that, because it sort of made the session lighter and sort of be more enjoyable. And then Hisu, you want to just go down the list on the right with that part of the role set?
I think people can read, so I'm not going to go through it. Other than say, our roles were really interchangeable, and so, I think Gary definitely was the class DJ. The students loved the class playlist. At the end, actually, students asked for the music for that evening, because we had music at the start of class, during breaks, transitions, all that. But I think, it was all about creating the learning environment, and I think, these are the different roles that an individual faculty person is probably playing. And so, when you have but they're unable to play all of these roles equally well. So the team dynamic, just helps people, I think, be more thoughtful about how to construct that learning environment.
So if I'm
and just going through the chat, Gary, I don't know, Laura had a question about rehearsal before class. Do you want to just say very quickly, because we should.
Yeah, so that takes us to that takes us to the next slide, which is pre-session monitoring and rundown. And we did that every class at the beginning. So even though we had all this planning that took place ahead of time, and we had a fair amount of planning that took place during the week before the next whole class session, before the whole class session, we had about a 15 or 20-minute window where we would be on before the students. And that turned out to be a real advantage, and I think an advantage over what we sometimes found on campus, where we couldn't get into the learning space ahead of time and configure things and get things ready. So yes, we always did that. That was kind of something that we did all the time. I think we had we used a lot of breakout sessions, both within the class, the synchronous class, and then the small team meetings. Jesus spent a lot of time monitoring the student chat, just like he's been monitoring the chat here, and would often then tee up the student questions in the chat. And that helped a lot with a lot of our students who were a little reluctant to jump in. So you want to talk about how you would weave gold out of the student comments, or not? You're muted.
I was going to say that I made it a point to interact with every student during the class session. So sometimes that was private messages. Sometimes it was, to pose a question. Oftentimes I would prompt students, hey, I know you said something about a particular topic in the async class discussion thread. Why don't you bring that up now? Or, but I really made it a point to use the chat to engage with every student. And I think, the students did not find it distracting. I think they found it to be like a really nice supplement to the video Zoom experience. And so, getting students just involved and engaged was really key.
And I think we had the advantage we had there was the classes were always 25 or fewer, and we're actually able to do that. And I think it's really, for those people who've taught online for larger classes, at least I have not seen great techniques for doing that, other than sectioning the classes and making them smaller again. So I think I think we're just about at the end. So maybe we just ought to end with the final slide on, what are we looking to do now? What are we still struggling with? And I would say there are 3 or 4 things that we're wrestling with. One is, I think we'd love to find even better team project management tools. We played around with Slack for a couple of semesters. We played around with Asana as a project management tool. Then we went to our own weekly reporting structure. But we keep thinking there's a great project management tool out there that would be great for students to use to learn a little bit more about project management. We're still searching for that. If anyone's got great suggestions, we're looking for that. We're going to be trying something in the fall that we haven't tried before, and this is Jesus' big push for us to do that, and that is we're going to reconfigure the course platform. So we're actually teaching a course on networked learning in the fall, and we're going to reconfigure the course platform so each group, not each student, but each team will be able to run its own course part of the platform. And create within that. So at the end of the semester, we will have 6 different experimental online learning environments that the students have created as part of their class, if we don't crash the server. We're also really, I think, still looking for, the magic bullet to help students become self-directed learners. We've tried more scaffolding, we've tried less scaffolding, and we haven't gotten a uniformly good, I would say, outcome. We've gotten success with a small group of students, but then haven't sort of reached all the students that we'd like to reach in the class. And then we're also trying to, or at least I'm trying to start experimenting with combining physical and digital artifacts within the digital learning space. And trying to see what impact, if any, that would have on the experience for students. And then the one I didn't mention that I think we struggle with every semester and maybe other people have as well. And that is, if you're doing self-directed project-based learning with teams, what are the challenges for evaluating students? And, particularly conveying to students that the class is going to be a place where it's safe for them to be experimental and innovative. So there's a question in the chat from Vicky about how to allow the teams to create their own courses within the platform, and we have not tried it yet. So I haven't actually installed it. We do a lot of the platform work over the summer when we're not teaching, but there's a multi-instructor plugin for LearnDash that once we put that in, then we can create the multiple courses and then assign the teams as instructors within those courses. And we'll be trying that in the fall, see how that works.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. I have so many questions. Are there any other questions in the chat or in the room? Okay, I actually have a question. What you just mentioned, that you are still trying to find ways of helping students become self-directed learners. The ones that you haven't been successfully seeing as being self-directed, what do you think? Is there something, a common thread why they might not be self-directed learner? Or is there hope for that, or what do you see as the obstacle?
Heesu, you want to start with that? You've thought a lot about that.
Well, I think, students are not used to that, right? Like, so their whole educational careers, they're more used to the sage on the stage model. And so even in the beginning of our course, I think in the beginning, students are like, what's going on here? They're going, when's the lecture? Maddie asked, I think in the best moments in Maddie's teaching, the students are doing a lot for themselves. And I think, it's just not an approach that many students are used to, and that really says a lot about educational systems in the United States and abroad. But I think that's got a huge part of it. I think, we've gotten some feedback. Can you just tell us the answer? And I think, where we have to push and say, we're trying to teach you skills through this content. And so I think that has a fair bit to do with it. What would you add, Gary?
I would say the other thing that we keep seeing is, a lot of students just want to minimize their risk. And so they want to know, what am I going to get graded on? And let me finish that and let me do no more than that. And I don't know whether that's because of the constant, all their history, or whether it's because the rest of their educational experience that's going on simultaneously is pushing them in that way. And so they come into our course and all of a sudden they just like to check the boxes because they got another course that's operating in a totally different way.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I've definitely had those same comments and seen those issues come up. But there's a lot more we could dig into. But sadly, we are out of time. But it was wonderful to hear about your team teaching and love the fact that you're scaffolding students into that process, and also really being very clear on, from what I've seen, not just you said on their roles and giving them ways to demonstrate that, but also on your roles. You're very clear on your roles too as instructors. So that's a lot to walk away with. So thank you very much to both of you, Gary and Heesu, and I really appreciate that conversation. Okay, and
thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.